Okay, we are back. This is Unit 2, Lecture number 1. And give me just a second. I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. This lecture, we're going to be looking at the section of the study guide number 2 called Colonial Politics. And then from there, we'll move into 1763, 1774. And then just the very first couple of bits of 1775, 1776. So let me open up a few things here on desktop. There we go. All right. So these first 2 lectures, we're going to be building our way up to the American Revolution. Sorry, guys, I'm just trying to get this thing to reset for me. Okay. Go to home. Go to share. All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about colonial politics, and that's going to involve taking a look at the British system of government and then the system of government that had evolved in the colonies, and then look at a few other things and then sort of see how these things kind of pull against each other. All right, hopefully you'll see more of what I mean when we get there. But let's start off with British government. Okay. On the verge of the revolution. The British at the time did not have a written constitution the way that the United States has a written constitution today. British government had sort of evolved over centuries, really. Some of what we're talking about goes all the way back to the early 1200s. But basically, there were 3 sort of parts of government. And I'm not going to get into the British court system because that is its own beast. All right. So the first sort of part of British government was, of course, the monarchy. And the monarchy, of course, represented the royal family, the military. The monarchy had a lot of its powers taken away during the Charles I, James I, Charles II, James II period. But the monarchy still had a significant amount of power in British government. Second would be the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords and the House of Commons together made up what was called Parliament. Okay, House of Lords, House of Commons. Okay. So these are your second and third parts of British government because, again, I'm not going to get into the court system because that is extraordinarily complex. And Parliament is the legislative part of British government. So it would be similar, not exact, but similar to Congress that we have today. Right. Now, the House of Lords represented or related to the landowners, and the House of Commons related to everybody else. So if you were a landowner, as I am, the House of Lords was your representation. If you were not a landowner, then you were represented by the House of Commons. Okay. Now, where this system begins to sort of break down is in voting. Because in order to vote in England or to hold office in England, you had to be a landowner. So again, I, as a landowner, would be able to vote in England, and if I wanted to, I could run for office in England, in the House of Commons. If you didn't own land, then you could neither vote in parliamentary elections, nor could you run for office in a parliamentary election. Now, where this becomes a problem is that the landowners in Parliament, the landowners in England, are only about 20% of men in England own land that would allow them to vote or to hold office. So what we really have here is a minority system. You have a small group of people who are pretty much making the important decisions in the country. This is also sometimes referred to as virtual representation. If you're the everybody else category, you do not vote, but you are represented virtually. Okay? We have virtual representation in the United States. We don't allow people under the age of 18 to vote. We don't allow felons to vote in a lot of states, and we don't allow people who are institutionalized to vote either. So we do practice virtual representation in the United States, but in England, it was really practiced, okay? 80% of the population had what was called virtual representation. Okay? They are the everybody else portion of this up here, okay? So that's British government. You have the monarchy, part 1, House of Lords, part 2, House of Commons, part 3. But again, it kind of breaks down here when only 20% of the people can vote for elections or even hold office in Parliament. Now, the colonies also had sort of 3 distinct parts of their government. Each colony would have had a royal governor, and royal governors were typically appointed by the king. Parliament would sometimes get involved, but usually the king had a pretty good idea of who he could get appointed as a royal governor. It was very rare for Parliament to oppose a royal governor. So that royal governor is really concerned about representing the king's interests in America. Then you have what was called the Governor's Council. And these could be, there were 12 members of a governor's council, and that is because there were 12 apostles of Jesus. And appointment could come about in different ways. Usually the royal governor had some say in who got picked. Parliament would probably sometimes, if necessary, get involved, and even the monarch. So there's a variety of different ways to wind up on the governor's council, but generally the council represents the interests of the king and of parliament. And then there was what was called the Colonial Assembly. The first Colonial Assembly had been back in Jamestown, the House of Burgesses. And the idea of a Colonial Assembly had spread as other colonies were planted. Eventually, the Puritans had a Colonial Assembly. We talked about how they restricted voting. The other colonies that were founded after the Restoration would have an assembly. And eventually Georgia, after James Oglethorpe rid himself of Georgia, had a colonial assembly. The colonial assembly was elected by the colonists in a popular vote. And if you wanted to serve in the colonial assembly, you also had to be a landowner. The difference, so this is just like it is for Parliament, that if you want to vote for the Colonial Assembly, or if you want to run for office for the Colonial Assembly, you have to own land. The difference, though, in England, it was 20% of the male population owned land. In the colonies, it's about 85% of people, men, are qualified to either vote in the colonial election or run for office. And so a lot of people who are on our currency, your Washington, your Jefferson, John Adams is not on currency, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, all of these people got their start in the Colonial Assembly because they were landowners and could run for that office. So this is what we call direct representation. You vote and you are represented. Okay. So that's the system we have for people over the age of 18 in the United States, as long as they're registered to vote and are not a felon in some states or currently institutionalized. So again, these are two very different systems. You have one system where you have a minority of people who are kind of used to making the decisions for everybody else. And you have this system where the majority of people are used to having some voice in their own government. So already we have sort of a clash of ideals about who exactly is in charge of one's government. In Britain, it's a minority system. In the colonies, it's a majority. Now we got to toss in a couple of other things as well. First was the idea of liberty. Liberty as an idea, well, it comes from 1215 Magna Carta, and it basically encompassed two things. Let me do the first one. First one is habeas corpus, which literally means produce the body. And what this means legally is that if you are arrested you have to be charged with a crime. Okay. And second, if you go to trial, you have a right to a trial by a jury of your peers. Okay. And these are two rights that all Englishmen recognized as their rights as Englishmen. They all English citizens have these rights. Okay. So if you were an English citizen living in India, you had these two rights. If you were an English citizen living in the Bahamas, you had these rights in British Bahamas, of course, and British India. And if you lived in America, the English colonies of America, you had these two rights. Okay. All right, two more things I need to add in here. One is the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights had grown out of the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution had been from Unit 1 when James II had been overthrown by Parliament in 1688. And so a Bill of Rights had come out of that called the English Bill of Rights. And there's another, there's a couple of things in there. There's a lot in the English Bill of Rights, but with regards to the American situation, there's only a couple of things that we need to know about. The big one taxes are implemented by the legislature, and that's really the only one I'm going to focus on here. Okay, basically this is to keep the monarch from coming up with new taxes, which is something that both Charles I and James II have been attempting to do. The problem here is which legislature. If I'm an American living in Virginia, is the legislature Parliament in London, who I don't get to elect, or the Colonial Assembly in Virginia that I do get to elect? Okay, and that is going to be an ongoing issue all throughout the rest of the 1760s and 1770s. This shows up in the Declaration of Independence. It shows up in a lot of other documents that who exactly is the legislature when we're talking about Americans living in the colonies. Okay? Is it the monarch? Is it Parliament, or is it the local House of Burgesses in Virginia? And then finally, the last thing to put in here, let me make sure I spell it right, what was called the royal prerogative. The royal prerogative still exists. There's not much to it today. I think today it mainly has to do with passports and stamps. But at the time that we're looking at, the royal prerogative was basically the authority of the monarch to do what was necessary to preserve the empire. Doesn't have that much authority to it anymore, but at the time, in the 1760s, that was quite a bit of power for the monarch to have. Let me take you into one of the tax issues and show you how these different things are going to sort of start to pull against each other throughout the 1760s and 1770s. All right. So let's start with the Sugar Act. Okay. Now, the Sugar Act, 1764, this is actually a tax on rum. Okay. It's not actually a tax on sugar. And what it did is it actually lowered taxes on legal rum to cut down on smuggling. A lot of people made money smuggling alcohol into America. John Hancock is one of those people. So this was hoped that if we lowered the cost of legal rum, it would cut down on smuggling. People would buy legal rum and pay the tax that the government needs to keep functioning. Now, if you were caught smuggling rum, you would be court-martialed by the Navy. Hold on a second. All right. Because liberty says trial by jury of my peers. What if I'm not in the Navy? Okay, that appears to be a direct violation of my rights as an Englishman. I'm being court-martialed and I'm not in the military. Okay, so again, we have this idea that the government needs the tax revenue to keep functioning, but we also have my rights as an Englishman, and those two things are going to butt heads against each other. And we'll see this with the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act and all the acts that come down through the next century. The other problem with the Sugar Act it's a tax passed by Parliament. But as a colonial, as a person living in Virginia, I don't get to vote for members of Parliament. I get to vote for my own colonial assembly. So again, there's a clash here about who exactly is in charge of tax policy for the colonies. Technically, I can make the argument that yes, Parliament is in charge of taxes, but I can make the same argument that the colonial assembly is in charge of taxes. Both views are correct. It just depends on which side of the struggle you're going to take here. So that is an example of the way these things are going to begin butting against each other, particularly this issue over taxes, not only who's passing these tax laws, but who's enforcing them and how they're being enforced. We're going to see a lot of that as we start making our way into the 1760s and 1770s. As far as being court-martialed by the Navy, that would go back to royal prerogative. Okay. The monarch needs to maintain taxes to maintain the empire. That's going to clash with my rights to a trial by jury. Okay? Both are technically correct. The monarch's argument is correct, but so is an English citizen's argument. you can have both arguments be correct at the same time. Okay, our own Constitution has parts where it clashes, often depending on which side of the argument you're on, as to which side you're going to come down on. All right, why is all these taxes being passed on us? Well, the 7 Years' War, again, had doubled British debt. British national debt now stood at oh man, 133 million pounds. And again, that was doubled by the 7 Years' War. So that's one reason for the taxation. The second, let me put this up here real quick. So we have reason number one, reason number two. Britain has left a standing army in America, and that army has to be fed and watered and housed. So it seems fair and reasonable to both George III and to Parliament that the Americans should pony up some cash. Again, the 7 Years' War had started in America. It had been fought over American issues primarily and had led to a doubling of the debt. And Britain leaving an army in America, that army also has to be fed, watered, and the Americans should pony up for that. We had the same discussion in this country after Iraq, whether or not Iraq should pony up some of their oil money in order to pay us for services rendered. So it seems pretty reasonable, at least to George and to Parliament. But it's not going to quite go down like that among the Americans. We already looked at the Sugar Act. A lot of people weren't really affected by the Sugar Act. It was mainly people who smuggled alcohol for a living. After that was a Quartering Act, which isn't on your study guide. That one mainly affected large cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. But then came the Stamp Act in 1765. This is kind of when all hell broke loose. The Stamp Act placed what were called tax stamps on written documents. So anything that you went and got from a doctor, anything you got from a lawyer, anything you had to file with the county, deeds, wills, ownership papers, medical license. If you're a lawyer going into practice, you have to register your law firm, that type of stuff. And then eventually, pretty much anything made out of paper, such as paper or newspapers or playing cards, or everything like that. The best way to think of the tax stamps as is a sales tax. It's not a particularly heavy tax, the way, say, property tax is, but it is a tax that sort of causes prices to rise and affected the majority of colonists. Again, the Sugar Act had only affected a very small group of people. The Quartering Act It only affected a very small, well, a few cities. I shouldn't say a small group of people, a few cities. But the Stamp Act affected everybody, okay? Because that meant the cost of newspapers went up, the cost of a deck of cards went up, the cost of just regular stationery went up, costs went up. So this is the one that has the biggest sort of pushback from the Americans. So let's look at that pushback. First is the Virginia Resolves. This is a speech by Patrick Henry, and then it was later sort of printed up as a pamphlet and kind of, I can't spell Virginia. A speech, and then it's printed up as a pamphlet, and it's kind of sold throughout the colonies. And a lot of the ideas Patrick Henry puts forth are not new ideas. He just puts them in a way that everybody can understand. This is also where the phrase taxation without representation comes from, because what Patrick Henry is saying, he sort of explains direct versus virtual representation, right? That with with direct representation, you get to vote. And if the people you vote for tax you, you vote for somebody else the next time there's an election. Okay, that is direct representation. Okay, I voted for Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson passed some taxes I didn't like. He voted yes on the taxes. So next time I'm not voting for Thomas Jefferson. That is direct representation. This is not what the colonists have. What the colonists have is virtual representation. Okay, they're being taxed without being able to vote in Parliament's elections. Okay, that is virtual representation, and Patrick Henry is saying, that's bogus. Okay? And again, that is where you would get taxation without representation. The colonies are not represented in Parliament. So how can Parliament pass laws on the colonies? It's totally bogus. Second reaction is the formation of a group called the Sons of Liberty. They're a little bit more direct action. For instance, in Boston, the guy who sold the tax stamps, the Sons of Liberty burned his house down. In New York, the Sons of Liberty, the guy who sold the tax stamps in New York, the Sons of Liberty tarred and feathered him. So they're much more direct in expressing their displeasure. And their tactics worked. Eventually, it got to the point where nobody would sell the tax stamps. Okay? Nobody wants to get their house burned down, and you definitely don't want to be tarred and feathered. And then finally, what was called the Stamp Act Congress. 9 of the colonies met. Okay, so this is kind of like what Benjamin Franklin had wanted. 9 of the colonies met to formulate a unified response. Okay. And they send a petition to the monarch. And it basically explains why virtual representation is so bogus. Let me see if I have it here. Bill of Rights, hold on. Oh, shoot. Here we go. It is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted rights of Englishmen that no taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. I'm going to pull this up real quick. I just want the text. Okay, so let me just get 3, 4, and 5. That's really where it sort of ties it all together. Whoop. All right. So taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally by their representatives, that the people of these colonies are not and cannot be represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain, that the only representatives of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed on them but by their respective legislatures. Okay. There's a lot in the Stamp Act, but these are the 3 most important parts. And this is really what the Virginia Resolves have been talking about with regards to virtual and direct representation. Okay, it's laid out here in the Stamp Act petition. The other thing they do is they establish a boycott of British manufactured goods. So you'll remember part of the reason colonies exist is so that British manufacturers have someplace to sell their stuff to. So a boycott is going to go into effect. There's a lot of debate on how effective that boycott was. The Stamp Act is eventually repealed, but both sides claim victory. The colonists claim that the boycott worked. Parliament claims that they found another source of revenue and they didn't need the money from the Stamp Act. I think both sides are exaggerating their effect on the situation. But the Stamp Act is repealed in March of 1766, and both sides again claim victory. And then things kind of calmed down for about a year. And then Britain passed what were called the Townshend Acts. It was about 1767. And this did a couple of things. It raised taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, just those 5 products. All of which pretty much came from England. There's very little of this manufacturing of these items here in America. And then second, it closed down New York's Colonial Assembly. New York's Colonial Assembly had been kind of skirting the Quartering Act for about 2.5 years. And so finally, Parliament just closed down the New York Colonial Assembly. When other colonies protested, Parliament closed their assemblies. And that is a huge, huge mistake. Remember, the colonies, the colonial assembly is the only part of government that the colonists have any control over. And so to close that is a horrible mistake. It's one of the things we see in the Declaration of Independence, okay, for repeatedly closing our assemblies. So it's a huge mistake. And by about 1770, about half of the colonial assemblies have been closed. Now, the boycott is back in place, but it doesn't appear to be making a huge difference. Both sides have really sort of dug their heels in and are refusing to give up. And it will be an explosion of violence that finally brings things to an end as far as the Townsend Act go. On March the 5th, 1770, there was a protest at the tax house in Boston where a person would go to pay their taxes. A better place would be a customs house. And this protest had been going on for quite some time. There was a pretty large crowd who had gathered to protest the Townsend Acts. And there was a guard of British troops there. And so if we look at this, now this is Paul Revere's woodcut. You can see the British are all politely lining up and firing on command. And here are the Bostonians, innocent Bostonians, just being shot down in the streets. This is propaganda, okay? In reality, the Boston Massacre was a pitched battle between British troops and Americans. And one of the Americans killed was a free black, Crispus Attucks. So it's really more of a pitched battle, and no one is really sure who actually fired the first shot. What you don't see up here in Paul Revere's propaganda is that the crowd had been throwing rocks at the soldiers all day, and the crowd had been swinging. These are called lobster bats. See this bat Crispus Attucks is holding? Have been sort of swinging those like right in front of the British soldier's face, trying to get them to overreact. Okay, you don't see that in Paul Revere's propaganda. In Paul Revere's propaganda, you just see a bunch of people minding their own business who were then shot down by British guards. Okay, but again, you don't get the whole picture. Okay, that both the Americans really had been antagonizing the British guards for several days, and as usually happens, someone fired a shot and it all broke loose. In the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, the Townsend Acts were repealed, and Parliament really went out of their way to defuse the tensions that had built up. Again, blood has been shed and people have been killed, and people are pissed off. Okay, so Parliament really does what it can to defuse the situation. Repeals all of the Townsend Acts, and it does everything it can to get trade going again. The economy recovers in the Americas. There had been a depression because of the trade, but Parliament really bends over backwards to try to accommodate the Americans after the Townshend Acts. And that lasts for about 3 years before Parliament screws everything up again because it's Parliament. Parliament's next, whoops, did not want to print that. Parliament's next problem was the Tea Act, 1773. Now, what is the deal with this tea nonsense? Right? We've all heard about the Tea Act, but what is the thinking here? The Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea. Okay. And to understand the Tea Act and why Parliament dug its heels in, we have to understand the East India Tea Company and the predicament that the East India Tea Company was in. In the summer of 1772, let me shrink and dink the font here. Multiple bank failures broke out in England. Well, hang on. Let's pause. Let's go back up. Let's start with the East India Tea Company. Okay. In 1771, tea prices crashed. There was too much tea. And if you have too much of something, the price of it usually goes down, unless you're one of the seven sister oil companies and you have a monopoly and you artificially inflate prices, then they never go down. But the tea, there was just too much of it. And the East India Tea Company, EITC, was broke. It had massive debts. It owed money to the Bank of England, to the government, and to its shareholders. Okay, it was really in serious financial trouble. It needed £500,000 immediately and would need another £2 million just to weather 1773. Now, you're probably saying, tough shit. Okay. All right. You got too much of something, you go broke. That ain't no skin off my hands, elbows, ass, whatever. Well, here's a problem. We start to have those multiple bank crashes in England. And that means that the Bank of England is not going to give money to the East India Tea Company. Okay. Now, bank crashes back then are very different. If a bank in the United States crashes today, if that bank is protected by the FDIC, the money is protected. That didn't exist back here. Okay? If the Bank of England crashed, well, too bad. Okay? As the French say, le tough tete. Well, why should this matter? If the ETIC fails, then England will lose its grip on India to France and Portugal. Okay. The EITC was the British government in India. Okay, that was the British government in India. So if the ETIC fails, then England loses India to the French and the Portuguese. We can't let that happen. We being Parliament and George III. So if we sell the tea to the Americans without any tax on it, we'll make, again, we being the ETIC, make enough money to survive. That was the initial idea. That idea was rejected by Parliament for a couple of reasons. Let me move to a new slide here. I really wanted to do this in class, so I'm hoping it's getting across. One, Parliament felt the need to punish the Americans over the Gaspee affair. The Gaspee affair was a British ship that had been attacked and destroyed by some Rhode Islanders. And the British were unable to prosecute because nobody would testify against the guilty people. So, no tax-free tea for the Americans. We know who planned the attack on the Gaspee. It was a guy named Abraham Whipple and another guy named John Brown I. But nobody would testify against them in Rhode Island, and Parliament was really kind of pissed about the whole thing. Second, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson was against the tax-free tea because his salary was partially paid by the tax on the tea, and his son's business was involved in collecting tea tax. So he was also against the free tea, the tax-free tea. So for these two reasons, this idea, sell the tea to the Americans without any tax, is rejected. Okay, Parliament needs to punish the Americans for the Gaspee affair, and the Massachusetts governor opposes it because of his salary and his son's business. So what the Tea Act does is a lower tax on ETICT. Why is this such a big deal to the Americans? One, it is again taxation without representation. Even though a tax is being lowered, it is still being done without representation by the colonists. Second, making governors dependent on British taxes would make them less interested in representing colonies. Now, I know I said that the governor represents the monarch, but he also has to represent the colonies to the monarch. Okay, it's a double-edged sword. If the governors are dependent on British taxes, they are going to be less interested in representing the colonies. And then third, basically this is Parliament creating a monopoly on tea for the ETIC. And there is nothing to prevent future monopolies being created by Parliament. So maybe you're not involved in tea, but maybe you're involved in lumber, or maybe you're involved in tobacco, or maybe you're involved in rice or some other food stuff. What is to prevent Parliament next year from creating a monopoly for a tobacco company that isn't one you're selling to, or rice, or anything else? Okay. So again, the Americans have good reason to be pissed off about this whole thing. It is taxation without representation. It is a threat to governors and their independence. And there is nothing to prevent Parliament from making another future monopoly on something else. Now, the tea ships are going to arrive in Boston. Okay, right down here, the dock area of Boston. Okay. But nobody will unload the tea. So 3 tea ships show up. The dock workers, many of whom were Sons of Liberty, refused to unload it. So, well, the Sons of Liberty will unload it another way. And this brings us, of course, to the Boston Tea Party. On, I don't have the exact date, but December 1773, Sons of Liberty will dump the tea into Boston Harbor. Okay. They will come back the next day because some of the tea will kind of be floating like these mounds of tea that are just kind of floating in the water. They'll come back the next day with boat hooks and oars to push it down into the water to make sure that it's all ruined. They are thorough, if nothing else. The cost of this tea in today's dollars, somewhere around 1.3 mil. It's probably gone up a bit. I haven't checked. It's been a couple of years since I did the calculations on it. So this is not a laughing matter. That is an attack on $1 million worth of property. Parliament responds by passing the coercive acts. One, close Boston until tea paid for. And again, in their dollars, it's about 10,000 pounds. And the average American wage in 1773 was about 37 pounds per year. So again, it's a remarkable. Imagine if it was, if you make $50,000 or $60,000 in America today, and you've got a fine of 1.3 million, you're in a lot of trouble there. It's going to take a while to pay that off. Parliament sent more troops to Boston to prevent any further disruptions. And Parliament closed all local government throughout Massachusetts, essentially declaring martial law in the colony. Protest was pretty widespread. There was a feeling that Parliament had really kind of overreacted here. And we do get the meeting of the First Continental Congress. This is about September of 1774. We have 12 of the colonies. Georgia, it was too far, but they said they would fully support whatever decisions were made. So they get the boycott up and running. They also try a new tool called an embargo. Remember, there's a lot of raw goods that come from the colonies. There's tobacco, there's foods, there's timber, lumber. So we're going to try not selling it to them, see if that gets their attention. And then finally, a petition to the monarch, much like we saw with the Stamp Act Congress. Let's see if there's anything on it we haven't already kind of touched on already. Well, I don't even know where it's at. But yeah, the First Continental Congress also petitioning the monarch, kind of explaining the whole direct versus virtual representation and all that kind of stuff, hoping George III can do something, but he really can't. George III has no power over taxation. All that power belongs to Parliament. So they're really kind of barking up the wrong tree here. In 1775, Massachusetts under martial law. The governor, the royal governor, part of his duties as the governor was to seize artillery. There was a lot of artillery that had been left behind after the 7 Years' War. For instance, at Fort Ticonderoga, which is in upstate New York, there was about 100,000 pounds, like literally pounds weight of artillery that had been left behind. And there was a lot of stuff around Massachusetts. So the governor of Massachusetts was really concerned about that artillery being used on him and his troops. So he had started seizing that artillery, and he'd gotten pretty good at it, sending out sort of these raids to Malden and Marblehead and Salem and some other places. They would march out at night, and then they would get there first thing in the morning and destroy the artillery or seize it to take it back. Well, the governor heard that there was a place called Concord, which is on the Lexington Road right here, and that Concord had artillery and it had black powder. It had been manufacturing its own black powder. And so the governor decided he was going to send his troops out there to seize it. It doesn't quite go the way the governor hoped. Now, you see British troops do leave Boston. This is, let me get a quick, no, I don't want that. I didn't want that. Okay. So this is April 18th, 1775. Okay. So we see British troops leave Boston. Now they get to Lexington. There is a battle at Lexington. This was painted about 2 weeks after the battle. And you see the fight here on Lexington Green. Here are the Americans. And then after that, they leave Lexington and they head for Concord. And here they are marching into Concord. And here they are meeting a lot of armed and pissed off Americans. And the British meet a real overwhelming force here at the Old North Bridge. Is that what it's called? Yeah, the Old North Bridge. So now the British are forced to retreat. Having reached Concord, they did destroy the munitions. They did accomplish their mission, but now they had to start making their way back. And all of these Americans are in the woods surrounding them and attacking them as they make their way back through Lexington. And then the Americans hound them to about Cambridge, is about where the whole thing, where the British finally escape the Americans who have been pursuing them for several hours. 100 British soldiers were killed, and about 125 had been wounded. Now, how was this accomplished? A couple of things. How did the Americans manage to win at Concord? The British plan to march out to Concord was not a very well-kept secret. There's no proof for this. The British general who came up with this was a guy named Thomas Gage. He was the one who had formulated these plans to march out and seize all this artillery and stuff like that. The general thought today is that his American-born wife, Margaret Gage, betrayed her husband. There's no proof, but there's really nobody else who would have known 8 hours before the British even left Boston where the hell they were going. Thomas Gage himself seemed to believe that his wife had betrayed him. When they went back to England the following year, he refused to live in the same house with her. He only lived another 5 or 6 years, but he refused to live in the same house with her. So there's pretty strong indications that she was the one who told the Americans. What that meant is the whole Paul Revere thing. We go back to our little map here. Paul Revere left Boston before the British did. He was already gone while the British were still trying to get out. So we have Paul Revere, we have this guy, Dawes, I think his name is Samuel Dawes, and we have this other guy, Prescott. So we have a lot of people who are out and about. We tend to think of our colonial ancestors as early to bed, early to rise, but a lot of people were up that night. One lady, a widow, she was up guarding the carcass of a pig that had been slaughtered for her. She didn't want anybody to steal it. It was kind of hanging in her yard. And the British Army, these 300 troops, stopped at her house for water. And when they left, she went to the farm next to her. That was the militia captain for her district. And so what that meant is while the British were marching on this road, all these Americans were marching through the woods to get out here to Concord. So it's not just the Concord militia that's out there, it's militias from all over this route here in Massachusetts. So that leads to multiple militias at Concord by the time the British finally showed up in the mid-afternoon. So a lot of things working against the British, a stunning victory for the Americans. Holy crap. Word of Lexington and Concord spreads pretty quickly. Here it is. So it's in Connecticut within a couple of days. It's in Rhode Island the same day. It's down into Pennsylvania. It gets all the way down to the Carolinas within 2 weeks. So that is quick spreading news for 1775. There are two reactions to what happens at Concord, Massachusetts. First of all, the Second Continental Congress forms. This is about May of 1775. This will become Congress going forward. Two decisions are made here. First is to put together an army. There's a lot of militia groups that are sort of making their way to Boston, but Congress recognizes that needs to be centralized into a unified command. and that's going to be led by George Washington. Second is foreign aid. The Americans are smart enough to realize they're not going to be able to defeat the British on their own. So a committee of secret correspondence is formed seek aid from foreign nations. That is going to be headed up by Benjamin Franklin. Because of his scientific achievements, Benjamin Franklin is the most famous American in the entire world. Okay. Parliament's reaction upon hearing about Lexington and Concord is to pass what are called the Prohibitory Acts. And this is about December of 1775 when this goes into effect. This does three things. Naval blockade of the American coast, which is an act of war under international law. The British Navy is also authorized to seize American ships at sea or port, again, an act of war. Hire Hessian mercenaries to help the British Army put down the rebellion. The Hessian mercenaries, that is part of Germany today. So these are mercenaries that will come in and try to help the British Army put down this rebellion here in the Americas. Okay, so that's the Prohibitory Acts. That's where we're going to stop. So when we meet on Monday, we will pick up with Congress and Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, and then we'll do as much of the war and the peace as we can get to in 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And then whatever's left over, I'll just make another video of. All right, and so we'll stop sharing, and I will see you in class next Monday.